So welcome to Getting the Player Viewpoint. In this video, we're going to find out where the player is looking. We'll also be talking about out parameters, which is where a function actually changes the parameters you've given it, which is a bit nasty, and we'll find a way of taming that. We will be marking those out parameters up with a little macro. And then we'll be continuously logging the player viewpoint out every tick, so that at the end of the video, you'll be able to do something like this, look around and see the P for pitch there changing up and down, the Y for yaw, and the roll won't change because I can't easily rotate my character. Okay, see you soon. So welcome back. Let's start putting this thing together. So David, in a recent discussion, has brought up the fact that should we really be using components as much as we are? We are slightly over using components right now in that we are adding them to everything willy-nilly. That's not the only way to do things. We can modify the actor or the pawn class directly. I'm just trying to reinforce the use of components for now. Later in the course, we will be looking at other ways that we can modify actor behavior, so don't worry. So let's take a little look at our code. The first thing we're going to need to do, well, let's do a bit of pseudo-coding, shall we, as to what we're going to need to do every frame. So let's just have a think about roughly how this is going to work. We're going to need to do something like get the player viewpoint, this tick. So every tick, every frame, we're going to need to get the player's viewpoint, work out where they are and where they're looking. Then we're going to do something like ray casting, which is basically sending Superman's lasers out of his eyes, but with just one eye. So imagine a monoclops Superman with a little laser firing out. So ray cast out to reach distance. So that means we're going to need a private variable at some point to store that reach. And then what are we going to do? And then we're going to see what we hit, basically. And then we're going to go on from there. But look, this is enough to be getting on with. So what we're going to focus on this video is getting the player viewpoint this tick. So how do we do that? Well, I can tell you the method, or I can show you how I would find out. So what we would do is something like this. By the way, this extension is called Momentum. It's a Google Chrome extension called Momentum. Pretty in it. So what we'd do is with something like get player viewpoint Unreal. Okay, that search is a little contrived because I have happened to have been using almost exactly the set right words. But this is the sort of search you'd do. You'd have a little look through and you'd start to try and play a camera manager. That one's not helpful. You'd start to try and collate an idea as to how people are doing this. And when you get a consensus, here you go, could be this guy here, get player viewpoint, and that's asking for a location and a rotation. Returns a player's point of view for the AI. Oh, there should be like a full stop here. For the AI, this means the pawn's eye's view. For a human player, which is us, this means the camera's viewpoint. That's what we need. So we need get player viewpoint. And then what does that run on? Well, it runs on a player controller, right? So we've worked out how to get a player controller before. So if you want a micro challenge, I'm not going to put a slide up, but why don't you go and see if you can get the player viewpoint and log it out? If you don't fancy taking that on all in one go, then keep watching, and I'm going to break that down and then challenge you to just log it out to reinforce your logging knowledge. So a couple of choices for you depending on where you are in the course. So here we go. That's what we need to do. So let's first get the world, right? Because in order to get the first player controller, we need to get the world first, as we discussed by now. So we go and get the first player controller. Oh, I've missed an arrow, a chevron on my arrow there. Okay. And source control, the IntelliSense is not helping me yet. And that's because I've missed spelt. Okay, so the moral, by the way, of that, if you're a beginner, is that you really want to make sure you get your arrow operator in, and that down here there's no little wiggly thing that says that Visual Studio is still processing, and then you can use the autocomplete to prevent you from making errors. So get first local player controller is not quite the right one, so it's get first player controller. There you go. So that was the down arrow I used there to select and then return to enter. It's a method. Okay. And then we need to go in and say, well, what is this new method? Well, this new method is the get player viewpoint. By the way, you don't have to type it in order. You can just say viewpoint. So another way of discovering this would be to start at the very beginning and say, okay, how do we do this? Well, how are we going to get the player's point of view? Well, we need to get the world first because we're going to do a top-down search, and then we need to go from the world to what? Well, I need to get the player, the first player. That's the one, the first player controller. And then I'd say, and then I would need to get the viewpoint. Get player viewpoint. It returns me a player's point of view. Okay, so that's cool. So let's do that. And now let's see what it says and what parameters it wants. Look at this. It wants us to pass in an f vector. It's got an ampersand, which means it's a reference. Now, for now, let's just brush over what references are. They're a bit like pointers. They can't be reassigned to anything else, but they're basically an alias. They are just like the thing. Okay, so it's an f vector reference, but the bit that's important is that Unreal have named this parameter out underscore location, and the same as the rotator. So we're saying go get the player viewpoint. But the way that this is asking us to work is it's saying, I'm going to modify the parameters. Isn't this weird? Look, we've got a void getter here. We're saying get, and you would expect the things that you give a getter to specify what you want to go and get, to tell me something about what I'm going to get, but it doesn't. What this does is it says, you give me a couple of parameters, an f vector and an f rotator, and I will, like envelopes, right? And in those envelopes, I will put in the results and give them back to you. So the function's void, it returns nothing, but it changes the input parameters. I actually think that's pretty horrible on two counts. The word void space get makes me have one heart attack, and then the idea that these are out parameters makes me have a little second heart attack. But it's okay, we'll live with it. Let's show you a way of taming this. This is how I'm gonna tame it. What we're gonna do is we're gonna grab ourselves a couple of variables here. We're gonna declare f vector, and I'm gonna call it player viewpoint, or maybe with a capital P to be consistent with them, location, okay, and then I'm going to say an f rotator, player viewpoint rotation. So we've got a couple of variables to store things in. Now, what I want to do here is I'm going to pass these in, right, as variables. Now, the line's getting too long, so you're allowed to split your line down to something like this. When you've got multiple parameters or long parameters, it's perfectly okay to just split things away like that, okay? But I don't like the fact that I am actually changing these two values. When we come to log down here, log out to test, so this is a to-do, a temporary to-do, then I don't like the fact that I've made a variable here and then I'm changing it by making a function call. So there's lots of ways of taming this beast. Eventually you'll just get used to the fact that you need to be very careful about whether parameters are out parameters. At least Unreal has told us by putting out underscore that this is going to change the getter, the void getter is going to change the parameters that go in. I can't even believe I'm saying this, but we're dealing with an engine here and we can't change that. So this is what I do. I like to come up the top here and we can say hash define out. This is a blank macro of our own. We're saying don't do anything with that, but let's just hash define the word out. Now, what I can do here is I can mark these parameters with out. And actually, if I was to type it slowly and wait for Visual Studio to catch up, this is the little whirligig I meant down the bottom here, telling us that Visual Studio is still parsing files in the solution. Then as I start to type out, I know it's a very short word, but it will actually give you completion on that. And it'll give you syntax highlighting. So all I've done there is mark them with a macro that does nothing. Out does absolutely nothing. In the preprocessor, when we compile, but just before it compiles the code, it will substitute out with absolutely nothing. I just remove it, but it does allow us to annotate to remind ourselves for now that that's what's going on. Okay, what I want you to do is log out to test that this is working. I want you to continuously log out every tick. So that's going to be your challenge. Log the viewpoint every tick. Log the viewpoint position and direction every tick. Hint, you may need to use toString somewhere. Get used to working with different data types and give it at least 20 minutes if you're struggling, if you're new to coding, and then carry on watching for my solution. So pause the video and get that logging out now. Okay, welcome back. So let's get this buttoned up. Relatively simple. We're going to use a UE_log macro. And then the category name is going to be log temp for now. We'll start thinking about making our own categories when we need to. The verbosity is warning, so it comes up in yellow. And then we have this strange text formatter we have to send in. Now, whether or not we put a semicolon on the end doesn't matter, actually, because the UE_log macro doesn't care. But there you go. I'm going to not put a semicolon on the end because it's a macro. Okay, so it's not really any right or wrong, right? So it depends on how the macro is written. It's a bit odd, but there you go. That's macros for you. So UE_log text. Let's just write a quick test here, just to make sure that the log is even working and that all the code we have written so far is working. So I'm just going to build what I've got, which is basically nothing, apart from I have gone and got the world, and I am logging nothing. yet, but I'm checking that all the code around this works. Test, 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 every frame, good. So that's working. Now let's just get it working. So I'm going to say that the location is some string and that the position is some other string. Then after the brackets we put in player viewpoint location. Now what is this type? It is an F vector. Do we have a .to string? Yes, we do. And that's a method. Okay, now we've got too long. It's on too many lines. So I'm going to go over to the next line here. I'm going to indent that just for style. And then I'm going to put in the second parameter here, player viewpoint rotation .to string. And let's try this. I'm going to get a lot of logs here. Okay, so it doesn't like that. What is it about it doesn't like? It's quite likely that it doesn't like the formatting of our spaces. The other thing that it may not like is, remember that this log wants a T star pointer. It's really weird error that this log has. It's not the lack of semicolon. We tested that a moment ago. I wanted to prove to you that we don't need semicolons, but it's the fact that it actually doesn't want an F string. It wants a pointer to a T char. So we need to do a star, as we've seen before, excuse the guess there, to dereference. And once we've done that star, then it should build, and it does. Let's test it works, and then I'll relay out the code. There you go. Now as I move around, watch what happens here. You see my position and my location. Okay, I've said position and position. Look at me. Let's fix that. Rotation. And now that we have broken down the fact that the error wasn't the spacing, the macro probably can handle this white space, then we can relay it out like that, which is probably nicer and easier to read, right? So all fixed now. Let's see. Builds. I'm showing you the process. You know, this is messy success, sloppy success. Look at that. Rotations working in the Y, in the P. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. And I can't yaw here. So pitch, this makes it clear. You see the pitch changing there. P up, pitch up 90. Pitch 0, pitch 270. That's pitch axis. This is the yaw axis. You see the Y, the pitch is changing slowly, but the Y is changing fast. And roll, well, we can't easily roll the actor. Okay, roll would be where we tilt the horizon left and right. So that's it. We have actually managed to get the viewpoint of this pawn as we move around, which is pretty cool.